Before I start off on the economy, you asked a question of will Pakistan's elections be free and fair? The best comment on this I heard was way back in 1990 when Benazir Bhutto lost that election. There was a Pakistani bureaucrat who had come to meet my father, and my father asked him the same question: were the elections free and fair? So very nonchalantly he says, well, they were fair till about 9 o'clock in the morning. After that, they became free. So something similar is likely to happen this time around. But on the Pakistan economy, I think I can just answer the entire thing and be done with it in one word, which is no. Pakistan economy cannot sustain itself, certainly not in the present shape, form and structure. And you don't need to, it's not me saying no, it's the current caretaker finance minister, who's an economist, who said that, this is an unsustainable situation. Although she was talking about the debt, but it's very clear that it's about the economy, because the growth of debt is a kind of a function of what has been happening in the economy. The problem is for Pakistan that bringing about the sweeping reform which they require is among the most difficult and disruptive things in governance, because it unleashes and I'm paraphrasing and distorting what Joseph Schumpeter said. Reforms unleash a process of regenerative destruction, which scares the hell out of every politician and establishment, and even more, a military establishment, because military men, and with all due respect to the military people sitting out here, you people are so used to a certain order, and frankly speaking, and again, no disrespect meant out here, you have very little knowledge or understanding about the complexities of modern economics. But of course, if you are a Pakistani army general, then like the IAS officers in India, you have all the wisdom in the world. So if life-saving reforms are not a palatable prospect, and they are not, because as Galbraith had once written, not for Pakistan, but I think it applies to Pakistan much more than any other place, that when the rich and the privileged are also corrupt and incompetent, they never accept rescuing reform. So what they do is they tend to tinker around the edges in the hope that things will finally improve. And very often, they do improve for some time, or at least give the impression that they are improving. But very soon they run out of steam because, they are not addressing the real issues, and the next crisis ends up being even worse than the previous one. Now, this is exactly what has been happening to Pakistan. They're already in their 23rd IMF program, and by next year they're going to go into their 24th. It's the writing on the wall. And at the end of each program, and incidentally, they've only completed one of these 23 programs, and even that one was done because of geopolitical reasons. They were given a number of waivers. So, frankly, they completed the program, but they never did the kind of reforms that were required to be done. The crisis which they face after each IMF program eventually becomes a much bigger crisis than the one which they faced when they went into the IMF program. And what is even more important, the time period between these crises is shortening. The problem is structural, but the treatment is symptomatic, and that's why it doesn't work. Purely in technical jargon, Pakistan faces three big deficits. The first is the fiscal deficit, which is totally out of control. The second is the balance of payments deficit. And the third, which is a function of the two, is what is called the savings investment deficit. In very simple terms, Pakistan consumes more than it produces, it spends more than it earns, it saves and invests less than it should, it doesn't export enough, and imports more than it should because of its dependence on imports for growth, revenue, and for food and energy, things are unsustainable. According to some study, every time the Pakistan economy grows by over 3% or thereabouts, it gets into a balance of payments crisis. In other words, growth in the economy is circumscribed by the external sector, which also has a bearing on Pakistan's energy economy, which is so broken that it is almost beyond repair. The circular debt, and I'll come to this in a bit, and I'm sure the chair will allow me a little bit of extra latitude because of She brought in that old. We've known each other for very long, so I'm sure she'll give me that latitude. But suffice to say that the circular debt of the power sector, and this is why I say the energy economics is broken, has been rising exponentially. It was about 500 Pakistani rupees in 2013 when the People's Party government went out. That entire amount was settled in one go, and it was brought to zero in 2013 by the Nawaz Sharif government, which by the time it finished its 5 years, that 500, which had been brought to zero, had gone up to 1.2 trillion or thereabouts. By 2023, which is right now, the latest figure of the circular debt is about 2.6 trillion Pakistani rupees. It is rising by almost 1 trillion rupees every year, and is likely to become gallop even faster, because new capacity payments to power producers are likely to rise in the next couple of years, and they will go. So this debt, the rate at which this is rising is likely to rise higher. And again, if, for example, if energy prices, if oil and gas prices go up, then they're going to go belly up. There's just no way they can afford it. And I'll again touch upon this later on, time permitting. Now, these capacity payments, some of these have been renegotiated, but that's more of a long-term kind of a thing. But the Chinese, for example, who are now owed almost close to about $2.5 billion in back payments, they are refusing to renegotiate these capacity payments. And because of that, this whole CPEC thing is now coming unstuck. Even so, over the last few weeks, you would notice that many people are saying that the Pakistan economy is out of the woods. It's getting back on its feet. This is exactly what I was saying, that, you tinker around the edges, some things start working out, and, you start singing praises of the great general who has been bestowed on them by Allah himself, because every general is, of course, Allah's gift to them. The stock market right now is booming, and this despite the fact that industry is shutting down. Industry is closing down regularly. Despite that, stock market is booming. Nobody knows how. The rupee has recovered from historic lows. The businesses are less skittish and panicky. The revenue collections have been as per target. The current account deficit is controlled, etc., etc. You will keep hearing all of this, but you start looking a little closer, look into the more granular details of what's happening, and you realize how brittle and tenuous this so-called recovery is. The rupee value has improved, but not because of any inherent strength of the economy or it's got revitalized, but because of coercive administrative steps to curb smuggling of goods and siphoning off of dollars out of Pakistan. Now, smuggling and dollar smuggling also, or dollars flowing out of the economy, it's a function of the state of economy. So you can clamp down for some time, but that's not a very stable state solution, because the moment you start lifting off those clamps, it goes back to what it was. And this is something which very often administrators do not understand, but this is economics 101. The real value of the dollar really is when it can be readily procured in the quantity required, and that's not happening. Smuggling, of course, has been curbed, and it was done even in the past, but this again is band-aid, simply because you do not have the mechanism to sustain this endlessly. And what is even more interesting is that the Pakistanis have always boasted that, look, the formal economy can go to the dogs, but it's the parallel economy, which is basically the black economy, which keeps Pakistan going even when the formal economy is failing. Now, this is, you'll see all kinds of spin doctors, the Mushahid Hussains of this world, who'll keep saying, peddling this, Javed Jabbar, etc., who keep talking about this, which obviously means they're utterly ignorant about how economics works, but that's another matter. So remember two things. The stronger the parallel economy, the weaker the formal economy. And it is the formal economy which actually decides whether a state fails or a state survives. Secondly, the parallel economy is the only game in town for most of the marginalized and the fringe areas of Pakistan where there is no other economic activity. So when you end this smuggling, what you are doing is you are going to end up with a much more disaffected and alienated population in those areas, which is already disaffected and alienated, and this becomes a powder keg ready to explode. And this is especially true for places like Balochistan and KP. The revenue, again, has met the target, but not because trade and industry has started doing better or tax collections have increased, but because non-tax revenue, and essentially just one feature of non-tax revenue, which is the State Bank of Pakistan profits, which have been paid as dividends to the government. Current account deficit is low because imports have been clamped down upon, despite IMF advice to the contrary. Now, because imports are not free, industry has been closing down. Exports haven't picked up, again, because, there is nothing to export, except for rice, and that also because India imposed a ban on export of rice. Inflation is currently close to around 30%. The sensitive price index, which really matters, which is the bread and butter stuff, is close to 40%. A lot of this inflation is, of course, the result of hikes in power and gas tariffs, and the impact of those hikes, which have taken place over the last few weeks, are still to play out in the rest of the economy. But suffice to say that the high rate of power and gas means that industry is not competitive. Interest rates are at about 22%, and this is the base rate or the policy rate as it's called, which means that if you have to borrow money from the banks for business or any other purpose, you get it at about 24-25%, maybe even higher. Clearly, that's an untenable proposition for any businessman. Despite inflation being high, tax revenue has not increased. So this is important. The revenue has increased because of non-tax revenue, but not because of tax revenue. Tax revenue has been marginal. Rule of thumb is that if inflation is at about 20%, then at least your tax revenue should grow by about 20%. Rule of thumb. But clearly that's also not happening, which means that industry is not producing enough. Now, the higher the interest rates mean higher the debt servicing, which is more than what has been budgeted for. Foreign inflows have been drying up. There is no money coming in, and this is despite the IMF arrangement. When the IMF standby arrangement came, the Pakistanis started celebrating as though the manna from heaven has come. But unfortunately, apart from the $3 billion and about $1 billion has been given so far, nothing else has really flown in. Unemployment is in double digits, and poverty has increased. The latest estimates are that, and these are by independent economists, that more than 40% of the population is below the poverty line, and this is increasing. Economic distress levels are at a record high. Pensions and defense expenditures are going through the roof. And these are going to rise. Pensions, of course, have become unsustainable, and I know there will be many people out here who think that, this Agniveer scheme and all of that is a harebrained kind of a scheme. Yeah, yes, it can be improved on, but frankly, pensions are a big burden on the governments, and they have to be sustainable for governments and states to survive. Otherwise, states will go belly up. But in the Pakistani case, defense expenditures cannot be brought down, partly because of the domination of the military in civilian affairs, and partly because Pakistan is now getting into wars of attrition, which are extremely expensive. These are not low-cost wars. They sap the vitality of the country, you really can't fight these wars endlessly on an empty treasury. Which is what is worse, is that regardless of any fancy SIFC or whatever else you set up, if you have bomb blasts going on, if you have the kind of incidents which we saw a couple of days back, it fouls up the investment climate. And this is notwithstanding the fact that the Saudis might have bought some shares in a company. All of that is besides the point. That's not the fix for the economy. On the fiscal front, Pakistan has crossed the Rubicon. The entire revenue of the federal government is not even enough to pay for debt servicing. Its estimates of debt servicing are about ₹1 trillion less than what they should have been. Everything is run on debt, which means debt is constantly ballooning and becoming even more unsustainable. Over the last 25 years, the stock of debt in the Pakistan economy has been doubling every 5 years. That means growing at a compound rate of about 14% per annum. And that, what is even worse, is that it has now crossed the 20% mark. It's rising by almost 20-21% per year. So while debt has been doubling at this rate, and what is more, the Chinese debt is now forming the bulk of Pakistani debt, the growth rates in Pakistan have simply not kept pace. So if you look at the record of how the economy, now there's nothing wrong in debt per se, and frankly, when people talk about, the debt GDP ratio, and this is what very often Pakistanis say, that our debt has not gone through the roof, it's just about 80% of GDP, that's utter nonsense. Bankruptcy is a function not of the quantum of debt you have taken, it is a function of whether you can service that debt or not. And clearly, the situation in Pakistan is that they cannot service that debt. Now, many Pakistanis think that, they will be able to renegotiate, they'll be able to restructure, or the more acceptable terms these days is we can reprofile our debt. And that should be able to work. Frankly, the moment somebody says this officially, it starts spooking the international debt markets, international financial markets. But what is even more is that this is easier said than done, because it has very serious repercussions for access to finance in the international markets. But even more importantly, when people ask you to restructure debt, they will ask you how are you going to do it domestically, because that is the bulk of your debt. And once you start restructuring domestic debt, it's utterly brainless to say, but domestic debt you are going to pay off in rupees, international debt you have to pay off in dollars. That's utter nonsense. You just can't keep printing money to pay off your debt, because then you have a Zimbabwe on your thing, or a Venezuela. You can take your pick, which you think is a better run country. But clearly, you have a serious problem on your hands when you go in for debt restructuring. And this, even the international debt, and as many Pakistani economists have said, that even the international debt, the ability to reprofile, restructure, reschedule that debt is very limited, because you can't do it to multilateral debt, you can't do it to commercial debt, and the Chinese will not allow their debt to be restructured. So what does that leave you with? Very little. And it's not going to make much of a difference. So while debt has been growing at the rate which I've just told you, growth has been on an average 2.5%, 3% thereabouts. And this in a country where population growth, according to latest estimates, is 2.55% per annum. So clearly, when you have a growth which is so anemic, the ability of the government to raise revenue to meet its basic expenses is being severely whittled down. And one solution which is being said, again, a band-aid solution, that, we've had this NFC award, and what we need to do is we need to revisit that so that this federal government has more resources at its disposal. Resources for what? Number one, what does it do to the provinces? Ultimately, the provinces have to run. And if you are going to take that money from the provinces and give it to the federal government, how do the provinces manage their finances? So are you then going to get into a major logjam on the financial level and at a political economy level? So clearly, there are very, very serious problems. And, this kind of a thing that we'll set up this SIFC, and then, the great generals will go around. No, generals, it's not their job to carry out road shows, for attracting investment. But in Pakistan, like in India, IAS officers do. In Pakistan, army officers do that. They go all over the place and prance about like they are the biggest geniuses in the world. But frankly, it doesn't lead it doesn't solve your problem. It doesn't solve your problem because, yeah, maybe some investments might come, but ultimately anybody who invests is not doing it for the love of Pakistan. They're doing it because it's a fruitful investment. The Chinese experience is already before everybody, and the Chinese have literally taken their hands off, or the foot off the pedal. So there's very little Chinese investment coming in. Because they feel that apart from security and other factors, that this is not an economy where they will even be able to recover their money. I'll just take 2 minutes, ma'am. So finally, let me just say that with all this, which is happening in the economic sphere, the biggest problem to my mind is they have no idea how to fix it. There is no reform impulse, of course. And if your idea is to bring in Nawaz Sharif with that disastrous finance minister of his, Ishaq Dar, who's basically a chartered accountant who thinks that just if I balance the books, the economy will take off, then boss, you really have a big problem coming your way. So I think that's a bigger problem, that they have no vision on how to set this thing right. And then you are going to get into a IMF program in the next year, under an elected government or a selected government, I don't know which. And when that happens, the reforms which the IMF is going to be asking for is going to unleash yet another round of economic distress. And frankly, if you're consuming about 1,000, 1,200 units of electricity, that means you're a normal middle-class family, and you are having to pay 70 rupees a unit or 60 rupees a unit for that electricity. It's something you are inviting trouble for yourself. So it's not sustainable, certainly not sustainable in the way it is structured right now, but restructuring it, frankly, I would only wish it on the Pakistanis, I wouldn't wish it on any